Okay, the last type of properties is we did properties of equality, properties of addition, properties of multiplication. The last category I call the big three properties. Okay, this is your LeBron, your Kyrie, your Kevin Love properties. These are probably the ones we're going to use the most in algebra. The first one being the associative property. And again, these shouldn't be new to you. I'm sure you've heard of these before. First one's the associative property. Okay. Well, what does associative mean? It should sound like another word you know. It should sound like the word association. Okay. Well, what's an association? An association is a group. The associative property deals with groups. Okay. Now, the associative property works for two types. So you'll see the associative property of addition, and you'll see the associative property of multiplication. Okay. It's a property that works for both of them. So really this is two separate properties, but we're just going to put them together. Okay. So when you're, if you're doing a homework or a quiz or a test, don't just say the associative property, say which operation it's the associative property of. All right, but like we said, the associative property deals with groups. And what the associative property states is that the way we group numbers or values, when adding or multiplying, the result won't change. So the way we group addition or multiplication does not change the result. Now this only works if it's all addition or all multiplication. Alright, so for example, if you have A plus B in parentheses plus C, the result of that, whatever A, B, and C are, the result of that's going to be the same if you would have grouped B plus C together instead. Okay, that's what we mean by groups. We mean, whatever you have in parentheses. Okay, the quantity of these two first, the first order of operations. Okay. And like I said, the same thing applies for multiplication. If you have A times B in parentheses and then times C at the end, you'll get the same result. Again, it doesn't matter what A, B, and C are, as if you would have grouped B and C together. Okay. Now notice in both of these examples, the order of A, B, and C did not change. Okay. So that's going to be the big way we tell the difference between this property and the next property. So the order didn't change, just whatever the values or the variables that were in the parentheses did change. Okay. All right, so that's the associative property. The second of the big three properties, and again should sound familiar from previous math classes, is the commutative property. Well, what does commutative property mean? What does commutative mean? Okay. This would sound like a word that you're familiar with as well. Commutative, it sounds like the word commute. And what does commute mean? It means to move. Okay, like my commute to work is my drive to work. Okay. The commutative property is also of addition and of multiplication. So again, what does commute mean? It means the order, okay, the movement. So you're actually changing the order of these equations. The short of it is that the order changes, but the groups do not. So the order in which you multiply or add will not change the result. So the order in which you add or multiply does not change the results. All right, now the key in this one is that the groupings do not change. So in the commutative property, the groupings don't change, but the order does. And then in the associative property, the groupings change, but the order does not. So for example, the basic one is if you have A times B, that's the same as B times A. It's the same result. It's not the same, when we were translating expressions, we didn't count those as the same. But their answer is the same. 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2. Okay. Again, different sentence, but same results. Same thing with addition. You could have A plus B plus C, which is going to give you the same result as C plus A plus B. Now, if there are grouping symbols, this is where people get confused. A lot of people they see parentheses, they automatically think it's the associative property. But if you see something like A plus B plus C equals B plus A plus C, that's actually not the commutative property. Or that is the commutative property, sorry. That's not the associative property. So people see parentheses and think groups associative property. In this case, it's not, because the order changed, but the values in the parentheses did not. The values in the groupings did not. Both of them have an A and B in the grouping. Okay. What did change is we went from ABC to BAC. The order changed, okay, which makes it commutative. Okay. So just because there's grouping symbols does not automatically make it the associative property. All right, and the last property, my favorite of the big three, is the distributive property. Okay, this is going to come up all year. If I can spell it right. The distributive property occurs when you have a number or a value or a variable outside a grouping of parentheses, outside any grouping, really. Now, order of operations states that we would have to, so say we have A times the quantity B plus C. Okay. Order of operations says we have to get rid of the grouping symbol. So usually what we would do is we would just add B and C. The problem is B and C could be numbers, but they could also be variables. So you can't necessarily add two variables together. So if you need to get rid of the parentheses, you need to get rid of the grouping, but you can't actually combine what's inside, you could use the distributive property. So the distributive property, again, it's easier to just see it visually, so I'm not going to write this one out with words. The distributive property takes the value out front, okay? Because remember, this is A times the quantity B plus C, and it just does each multiplication separately. So you're going to do A times B, and then you're going to do A times C. Okay. So you're distributing that A, you're distributing that number out front through multiplication into everything that's inside the grouping, everything that's inside the parentheses. This is the way you'll see it most of the time. But you could also, I call it backwards distribute. So if you had your grouping in front and you had your value behind, you could also distribute backwards. So you could do X times Z. And then you could distribute the second one, just give you YZ. So it doesn't matter if the value is in front of the grouping or behind the grouping. It's the same thing because it's still a multiplication. This one's the quantity x plus y times z. Okay? Well, if we need to get rid of the parentheses, but can't simplify, you distribute the z, and now we don't have grouping anymore. One thing you do have to be careful on is the sign. So the sign to the left of a value always stays with that number or variable. So the sign to the left of a value stays with it. So for example, if you have -2 times the quantity x minus 5. Now again, notice that, so we have numbers in this one, it's not all symbols. We want to combine x minus 5, but we can't, because we don't know what x is. So to get rid of the parentheses, we're going to use the distributive property, distribution. So we're going to take -2 times x. Okay. And then the second one is we're going to take -2 times, not 5, but -5. Okay. So that negative is with the 5. So we're going to do -2 times -5. And then simplify from there. -2 times x is -2x. -2 times -5, and negative times a negative is positive, so that's plus 10. And that's as far as we could go right now, simplified. Alright, let's try one more. It doesn't necessarily have to be just 2 terms in the parentheses, we could have more. So let's say we have -3 on the outside, and inside it's -3 times a plus 2c minus 7. Okay. Now I like to draw arrows. I always draw arrows to kind of, and each arrow signifies a multiplication. So we're going to do the term on the outside times the first term inside. -3 times a. I'll write it out. Again, you could skip these steps. -3 times a is just -3a. But I'll write it out. Then you got -3 times 2c. And then last multiplication, again, is -3 times not 7, but -7. So again, notice that every term in that grouping kind of that -3 got applied to it. Okay, and the application is multiplication. Now we'll just simplify it. -3 times a is -3a, like we said. -3 times 2c, you won't multiply numbers with numbers and variables with variables. So you do -3 times 2, which is -6c. And then -3 times -7, positive 21. Alright, so those are the big 3 properties, which we're going to be using a lot of in the future.